the will reading was over, on the church steps, she breathed. No grudges? Before her hand, cold as steel, struck my face, I didn't cry. I simply counted my heartbeats and glanced over her shoulder. The traffic camera captured everything. She thinks she owns the company, and me, as of tomorrow, but the balance sheets and the codicil already own her. My name is Mara Quinn. I am 32 years old, and I learned long ago that grief is a resource, not an emotion. The air inside St. Wren's Church in Northwick was stale with the scent of old wood, wilting lilies, and the collective, unexpressed avarice of my extended family. A dry autumn wind rattled the stained glass windows, casting fractured, colored light across the pews where my relatives sat like stone effigies. They were here to witness the final disposition of my father, Ethan Quinn, or more accurately, his assets. His body was already in the ground. Now came the part they actually cared about. From my seat in the front pew, I watched his lawyer, Mrs. Hilliard, a woman built of sharp angles and gray tweed, adjust her glasses. Her voice was as dry as the rustling leaves outside, a metronome ticking through the legal jargon that would dismantle my father's life into clauses and percentages. Directly across from me sat Celeste Rourke, my stepmother, the chief financial officer of Rivengate Therapeutics. She was a masterpiece of corporate grooming, her blonde hair sculpted into a severe but elegant chignon, her black dress tailored so perfectly it seemed fused to her skin. She met my gaze with an expression of serene, practiced sorrow. It was the same look she gave the press after a quarterly report missed its earnings target by a few cents, a performance of palatable concern. I had sat in the back of those press conferences, just as I had sat in the back of my own family dinners, observing. Mrs. Hilliard cleared her throat. To my daughter, Mara Quinn, she read, her voice unchanging. I bequeath my personal effects, the contents of my library, and a minority, non-controlling stake of 10% of my shares in Rivengate Therapeutics. A collective, silent exhale seemed to pass through the room. 10%. An insult dressed up as an inheritance. Furthermore, the lawyer continued, her eyes fixed on the paper as if it were a sacred text, the voting rights associated with these shares shall be held in temporary trust, to be administered by the executive board of the corporation, co-chaired by Celeste Rourke, until such a time as the board deems appropriate for their release. There it was, the final turn of the screw. She hadn't just taken the company, she had taken my voice, my father, a man who had taught me to read financial statements before I could properly ride a bicycle, had effectively gagged me, handing the lock and key to the one person he knew I would never trust. I felt Celeste's eyes on me, a physical weight. I didn't flinch. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded in my lap, my breathing even. I had anticipated this. I had modeled this scenario, run the numbers on this exact outcome. Emotion was a liability in risk analysis, and this was the ultimate risk. The rest of the will was a formality, generous donations to charities Celeste sat on the boards of, minor bequests to distant cousins who now looked at me with a new kind of pity, and the remainder, the vast, controlling interest of the company my father had built from nothing, left to his beloved wife. When Mrs. Hilliard finally folded the document, the silence was broken by the rustle of expensive fabrics as everyone stood. The performance was over. Celeste moved first, gliding towards me with the predatory grace of a shark. The air shifted around her, thick with the scent of her bergamot perfume, a sharp, citrusy smell I'd always associated with boardroom ambushes and hostile takeovers. She reached me just as we stepped out from the heavy oak doors of the church and onto the stone landing. The wind was sharper here, whipping strands of hair across my face. Her hand, cool and heavy, landed on my shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort, it was a brand. No grudges? She whispered, her voice a silken thread of insincerity meant only for me. Her lips were inches from my ear, her breath warm. And then, her hand moved. It was not a shove or a push. It was a strike. Fast. Precise. The sharp edge of her palm connecting with my cheekbone. My head snapped to the side, a burst of white light exploding behind my eyes. I stumbled back a step, my heel catching on the edge of the top stair. For a split second, the world tilted, a dizzying wash of gray stone and pale sky. The pain was a sharp, blooming heat, a hornet's sting that radiated from my jaw to my temple. A gasp came from my cousin Richard, who was standing a few feet away. Instantly, Celeste's entire demeanor shifted. The mask of a grieving widow slammed back into place, now layered with frantic concern. Her hand, the one that had just struck me, flew to my arm, steadying me. The other clutched at her chest. Oh, my dear," she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for the departing relatives to hear. "I am so clumsy. I must have tripped. Are you all right?" She wrapped her arm around me in a grotesque parody of an embrace, her fingers digging into my bicep. Her apology was smooth, flawless, a perfect piece of corporate spin delivered on a church stoop. I pushed myself upright, shrugging off her touch. The metallic taste of blood was on my tongue. My pulse was a steady, thudding drum in my ears, a rhythm I focused on to anchor myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't touch my stinging cheek. I met her wide, feigning eyes and held her gaze. "Thank you for the confirmation," I said. My voice was low, devoid of heat. Confusion flickered in her eyes, a momentary glitch in her programming. She didn't understand. She expected tears, an accusation, a scene. I gave her none of it. I gave her only data she couldn't process. In the pocket of my wool coat, my fingers were wrapped around a small, silver USB drive. It felt warm against my skin. A stark contrast to the cold wind and the icy chill of her presence. It was the key. The slap wasn't just an assault. It was a trigger condition. It was the physical evidence my father's final, hidden letter had stipulated. I watched her turn away, her composure fully restored, and descend the steps to the waiting black town car. Its polished surface reflected the gray, unforgiving sky. As the door opened, the sunlight caught the license plate, a random string of numbers and letters that, in my mind, resolved into a countdown clock. She thought she had won. She thought the game was over, that she had consolidated her power and neutralized me in one swift, public act of dominance. She was wrong. The reading of the will wasn't an ending, it was an invoice, and I was here to collect. Rivengate Therapeutics is the crown jewel of the Northwick skyline. It's a 40-story tower of steel and blue-tinted glass, an architectural monument to sterile optimism. The logo, a stylized green leaf, cradled within a soft blue circle, is etched into the glass above the entrance and glows with a gentle, reassuring light at night. Our corporate slogan, displayed on a massive screen in the lobby and at the bottom of every press release, is "Healing the Future." It's a beautiful, hollow promise. The building itself is the promise made manifest. From the outside, it is all transparency and light. From the inside, you realize the glass is one way. The public face of this benevolent empire is Celeste. To the financial world, she is a titan. The financial matriarch of pharma, as one fawning profile in Forbes called her. She cultivates this image with the same meticulous precision she uses to structure a leveraged buyout. In interviews, she speaks in a warm, measured alto, her talking points always circling back to the same core theme: values, specifically family values. At Rivengate, we aren't just a company, we are a family, she'd said on a morning news program just last month, a soft focus photo of her and my father appearing over her shoulder. And that ethos of care, of legacy, of protecting what matters most, that's what drives our innovation. It all starts at home. The irony was a physical thing, a bitter taste at the back of my throat. Her home life was a series of acquisitions and mergers, and I was the underperforming asset she couldn't divest. I came to this family, this company, when I was 23, fresh out of a master's program in economics. I started in the lowest rungs of the finance department, a ghost who ran numbers and made coffee. But I was my father's daughter. I see patterns. I don't just read spreadsheets. I listen to them. I can hear the subtle dissonance in a cash flow statement, the off-key note in an earnings projection. Over 9 years, I climbed. Not because of my name. Celeste made sure my name was a handicap, not a privilege, but because I was good. I am now the director of risk analysis. My job is to see the disaster before it happens, to map the fault lines beneath the polished corporate surface. I read situations like a conductor reads a musical score, anticipating every crescendo, every quiet, dangerous lull. My father remarried when I was 24. The first dinner we had as a newly formed family was at a minimalist French restaurant with white tablecloths so stiff they could have cut glass. Celeste ordered for everyone. I remember the way she looked at me across the table, her eyes assessing me not as a daughter, but as a variable in a complex equation she was determined to solve. My father, caught in the late-in-life glow of a new love, was oblivious. He talked about synergy, about blending our lives. Halfway through the main course, as I offered a dissenting opinion on a market trend my father had mentioned, Celeste placed her wineglass down with a delicate, deliberate click. She waited for the waiter to move out of earshot. "Mara," she said, her voice soft, but carrying the density of a black hole. "A good daughter learns when to be silent." It wasn't advice. It was the first article in a treaty of unconditional surrender she expected me to sign. I didn't sign. I just started taking notes. My existence within the corporate structure became a study in strategic invisibility. All along the sweeping curved walls of the executive floor lobby hang framed photographs from Rivengate's history, product launches, charity galas, bell-ringing ceremonies at the stock exchange. Celeste is in the center of every one, radiant, exuding a potent blend of power and maternal grace. My father is usually beside her, and if you look closely at the photos from the last 9 years, you can often find me. I am a peripheral figure, a smudge at the edge of the frame, half obscured by a potted plant or a junior executive's shoulder. I'm the one holding the laptop, the one looking down at a binder, the one whose nameplate, if you could even read it, would mean nothing to the viewer. I was a necessary piece of the machinery, but one you never display to the public. Nameless, faceless, overlooked. It was the greatest strategic advantage I ever had. From my overlooked corner of the company, I saw things. The official story, the one told in our glossy annual reports, was one of steady, relentless growth. Net profits climbed quarter after quarter, a beautiful, smooth upward curve that delighted shareholders and analysts. But the numbers that mattered more, the ones that showed the actual cash moving in and out of the company's veins, told a different story. The free cash flow was erratic, anemic. It didn't track with the reported profits. It was like watching a film where the actors' lips were moving, but the words you heard were completely different. The money was coming in, but it wasn't staying. It was being diverted somewhere, siphoned off in a way that was artfully concealed by complex accounting maneuvers. Details become an obsession when you suspect you are being lied to. I started noticing everything. Celeste had a peculiar habit when she signed documents. She used a custom fountain pen with a broad nib, filled with a dark proprietary shade of sapphire blue ink, and her signature, always flamboyant, had a tell. The capital R in Rourke was drawn with a long, elegant tail that curled back under her name like a hook. It was a gesture of ownership, a graphical representation of her tendency to pull everything toward herself. I saw that hook on expense reports that made no sense, on consulting invoices from firms that didn't seem to exist, on internal fund transfer authorizations that were buried deep within omnibus budgets. That hook was everywhere. At home, the sterile, sprawling house my father had bought with her, all white walls and glass, the duality was even more pronounced. If we had guests, whether for a charity dinner or a political fundraiser, she was Mom. She would put her arm around my shoulders, her touch chilling me to the bone, and say to a senator or a banking executive, "You've met my wonderful daughter, Mara, haven't you? She has her father's brilliant mind." The words were praise, but the tone was pure possession. as if she were showing off a well-polished piece of the estate's silverware. But when the guests were gone, when the doors were closed and the masks came off, I was the lucky child. "You should be grateful," she'd say, walking past me in the hall without making eye contact. "Your father provided you with a life you never could have earned on your own." I was no longer a daughter. I was a charity case, a line item of generosity on her personal ledger. I never argued. I never corrected her. I simply recorded the data. I memorized every discrepancy, every slight, every shift in terminology. Because a small difference, I learned, is never just a small difference. A discrepancy in cash flow isn't a rounding error. It's a thread. The difference between calling someone daughter and the lucky child isn't a mood swing. It's a motive. Small differences are the cracks in a flawless facade. They are the loose floorboards that betray the hollow space beneath. They are the doors to the truth. And I had been gathering the keys for years. The first thread appeared in the Q3 quarterly expense report. It was a small, almost imperceptible bulge in the fabric of our financials. Consulting fees. They were always a nebulous category, a convenient catch-all for services that defied easy categorization. But this was different. The line item had swelled by nearly 30%, a statistically significant deviation that the preliminary summary had attributed to strategic advisory services for emerging market penetration. It was the kind of vague, corporate jargon designed to deflect further inquiry. For me, it was a flare in the dark. I drilled down. The payments weren't going to the usual big-name firms like McKinsey or Bain. They were funneled to 3 entities I'd never heard of: Larkwell Advisors, Osprey Path, and Margate Solutions. The invoices were pristine, professionally formatted, and submitted for vaguely defined services: market viability analysis, logistical framework optimization, competitive landscape assessment. The total payout over the last 2 quarters was just north of $8 million. $8 million for advice from ghosts. My investigation began not with an accusation, but with a simple cross-reference. I pulled the detailed billing reports from all 3 firms, which included itemized timesheets listing the hours logged by their supposed senior consultants. Then, I overlaid those dates and times with the official corporate calendar for our executive board and strategy committees. The dissonance was immediate and jarring. Larkwell Advisors had billed for a 12-hour intensive strategy session on a day when Celeste and the entire executive team were in Zurich for an investor conference. Osprey Path had invoiced for a full week of on-site integration support during the company's mandatory holiday shutdown in December. The hours didn't align with reality. Next, the signatures. The invoices were submitted digitally. The authorized by line bearing a scanned signature of the respective firm's managing partner, using a simple imaging program. I magnified all 3. Underneath the pixelation, I found it. A tiny digital artifact. A single misplaced pixel on the lower curve of the letter G in each signature. It was identical across all 3 documents. It was the kind of error that happens when you create a signature from a single source image file, then carelessly use a lasso tool to copy and paste it onto different templates. They hadn't even bothered to create 3 unique forgeries. They had used one and assumed no one would ever look closely enough to notice. This wasn't just poor accounting. This was a deliberate construct. Shell companies. But funneling money out of a publicly traded company requires more than just fake invoices. You need a legitimate-looking reason for the expenditure, something that can be tied to a corporate initiative. I started digging through the archives of our enterprise resource planning system, the digital brain that tracks every component, every contract, every dollar from procurement to sales. I wasn't looking for what was there. I was looking for what wasn't. I found it in the procurement logs for a new clinical trial, a promising Alzheimer's drug codenamed XT4. There was a record of a major contract for specialized lab equipment, a purchase order totaling $8.2 million. But when I clicked the link to view the contract itself, the system returned an error. Object not found. This entry has been deleted. Entries in our ERP system aren't meant to be deleted. They can be voided, amended, superseded. but never erased without a trace. A deletion is an active, aggressive act of concealment, but our system, like most, has a safety net. The primary servers are backed up nightly to a secondary, archival server in a different state. It's a tedious process to access it, requiring multiple levels of security clearance which, as Director of Risk Analysis, I possessed. Late that night, long after the tower had emptied out, I was in my office, the only light the blue glow of my monitors. I initiated a remote connection and began searching the previous day's cache. It took 2 hours, but I found it. A cached version of the deleted contract, and I found something even better. The system access logs. The logs were a perfect, immutable timeline of every keystroke and mouse click. At 1:13 a.m., 3 weeks prior, the contract had been accessed and deleted. Then again at 1:13 a.m., 2 weeks prior, and once more at the exact same time the week after that. The user account that performed the action belonged to Janice, Celeste's executive assistant. No junior assistant would be in the system deleting multi-million-dollar contracts after midnight on 3 separate occasions without direct orders. This was Celeste, using her assistant's credentials as a flimsy shield of plausible deniability. The digital trail was damning, but I needed to connect it to the physical world. The address listed on Osprey Path's invoice was in Arden Park, an industrial suburb south of the city. I paid $60 for a priority tasking on a commercial satellite imagery service. 4 hours later, an email arrived in my encrypted inbox with a high-resolution aerial photograph. The corporate office of Osprey Path was a single-story brick building with a corrugated steel roll-up door. A faded sign for a defunct auto body shop hung crookedly above it. There were no windows, no cars in the cracked parking lot, no signs of life. It was a garage, a drop box. The money trail now had a physical dead end. I needed to connect the funds directly to Celeste. I went back to the cached contract for the lab equipment. Attached to it was a shipping manifest from the supplier. At the bottom was a notation for a customs and brokerage prepayment. The payment method was a corporate Amex. Only the last 4 digits were visible, but it also included the 3-digit CVV code from the back of the card, a common requirement for manual card-not-present transactions. I ran a search through our corporate expense database for all American Express cards issued to senior management. I found a match. The last 4 digits belonged to a supplementary card issued to Celeste's office for client entertainment and travel, but it was the CVV that sealed it, for security. CVV codes are unique to each physical card. The code on the shipping manifest for an $8.2 million equipment purchase perfectly matched the code on the card Celeste used to buy dinners and opera tickets for banking partners. She had gotten sloppy, commingling her fraudulent transactions with her legitimate expenses. The final piece of the digital puzzle was understanding how she hid it from the auditors. I knew our internal audit team was competent but overworked. They relied heavily on automated scripts to flag anomalies. A sophisticated fraud wouldn't try to fight the system. It would reprogram it. The next morning, I stopped by the office of the chief auditor, a perpetually stressed man named Merton. I kept my tone casual, a colleague seeking a minor clarification. "Frank," I began, holding a tablet with a generic chart. "I'm running a workflow analysis, and I'm trying to understand the final reconciliation scripts you guys run at the end of each fiscal month. Can I just see the name of the primary macro you use to harmonize the expense ledgers?" He squinted at me over his glasses. "The big one? Just a consolidation script. We call it R-Smooth." R-Smooth. The R for Rourke. It was so brazen, so arrogant. It was her digital signature. The tool she'd had a programmer build to automatically smooth over the financial bumps created by her shell companies, reallocating the fraudulent expenses into dozens of larger, unrelated budget categories in fractions too small to trigger an automated alert. It was the digital version of her telling me to be silent. I had one last thing to check. That afternoon, I took a late lunch and drove to a strip mall 10 miles from the office. I paid cash for a cheap, prepaid burner phone. In the anonymity of my car, I dialed the number listed on the invoice for Margate Solutions. It rang 4 times before a man picked up. "Hello?" he said, his voice hesitant, laced with an uncertainty that no legitimate business professional would ever have. In the background, I could hear a television. "I'm calling for Margate Solutions," I said, my voice flat. There was a pause, a rustling of paper. Yes, this is Margate. How can I, direct your call?" He was reading. It was painfully obvious. I could practically hear the script in his fumbling words. I hung up without another word. I had it all: the shell companies, the deleted contract, the late-night logins, the satellite photo of the empty garage, the CVV match, the smoothing macro, the fumbling voice on a burner phone. I had a complete, multi-layered schematic of her fraud. I sat in my car in the sprawling, anonymous parking lot, the evidence a cold, heavy weight in my gut. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the chilling isolation of knowing a truth no one else could see. Back at Rivengate, news and rumors travel faster than the coffee brews in the break room. To share this with anyone, a colleague, a board member, even my father's lawyer, would be to start a war before I had chosen the battlefield. This knowledge was my own. The first move had to be mine, and mine alone. That night, the silence of my apartment was a ringing in my ears. The city lights of Northwick painted sterile patterns on my walls, but I saw only spreadsheets and legal clauses. The faint, phantom sting on my cheek was a constant reminder. The evidence I held was the key to dismantling Celeste's entire empire, but in the corporate fortress she had built, she controlled every gate. The will, as it stood, had left me outside the walls, completely disarmed. She could fire me, dilute my shares into worthlessness, and paint me as a disgruntled, hysterical daughter. I had the facts of her fraud, but she had the power of the narrative. I walked to the hall closet and opened it. My father's things were still in a garment bag in the back, untouched since I'd cleaned out his home. I couldn't bring myself to donate them, not yet. The scent that met me was his, a faint, lingering mixture of cedar, old paper, and the expensive wool of his overcoats. I unzipped the bag. Inside hung his life in tailored fabrics, his gray herringbone suit, his navy blazer, and the heavy black cashmere coat he wore every winter. It was this coat I reached for. It was his favorite, a timeless piece he'd had for over a decade. I remembered sitting on his lap as a child, playing with the heavy horn buttons. I laid it carefully on my bed, the fabric cool and impossibly soft under my fingertips. I ran my hand along the inside, over the smooth silk lining, and then I felt it. It was a detail no one else would ever notice, a flaw so minor it was invisible. For 2 inches along the left interior seam, just below the breast pocket, the stitching was different. The stitches were slightly larger, the thread a shade darker, and the pattern was a simple running stitch instead of the tight, perfect lock stitch used everywhere else. It was a 1 centimeter deviation from perfection. It was our secret. When I was 12, I had tried to fix a small tear in this exact spot myself, wanting to surprise him. My clumsy attempt with a needle and thread resulted in this exact, imperfect line. He had found it endearing and refused to let a tailor properly fix it. "It's marked now," he told me, a rare smile in his eyes. "It's ours." My heart hammered against my ribs, a slow, heavy beat. This was a message. My fingers, now trembling slightly, traced the clumsy stitches. I felt a subtle thickness beneath the silk, a small, hard object nestled between the lining and the outer wool. Using a pair of small embroidery scissors from my desk, I carefully snipped the first of my childhood stitches. I worked slowly, painstakingly, pulling the thread free until a small opening appeared. I tilted the coat, and something thin and metallic slid out, landing on the dark fabric with a quiet, definitive click. It was a key, not a house key, but a safe deposit box key. Flat and slender, it was made of a dull, silvery metal, cool to the touch. One side was engraved with the logo of an old private bank, Old Foundry Trust, an institution that catered to Northwick's oldest money. On the other side were two characters, H07. The next morning, I was at Old Foundry Trust when it opened. The bank was a mausoleum of wealth, all polished marble, dark wood, and hushed silence. A stern-faced manager with silver hair led me through a gate of polished steel bars and into a vault that smelled of cold metal and old secrets. He used his key. I used mine, and a long, narrow box slid free from wall H07. He slid it into a slot in the wall of a private viewing room and left, closing the heavy door behind him, leaving me in absolute silence. The box was surprisingly light. I lifted the lid. There was no gold, no bearer bonds, no jewelry. There was only a single, thick manila envelope. On it, in my father's familiar, elegant script, was my name, Mara. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside, there were two items. The first was a letter, several pages long, written on his personal stationery. The second was a slim, crimson-red envelope, sealed with a heavy wax stamp bearing our family crest. A note was paper-clipped to the front of the red envelope. The note read, "Mara, do not open this unless you have been subjected to physical harm by a member of our family. This is not a request. It is a condition." The slap. Thank you for the confirmation. My words from the church steps echoed in my mind. He had known this was a possibility. He had anticipated her capacity for this exact kind of violence. I set the red envelope aside and began to read the letter. "My dearest Mara," it began, "if you are reading this, then the worst of my fears have come to pass, and I have left you in a position of great difficulty. For that, I am truly sorry. I want you to know that the will read by Mrs. Hilliard was a performance. It was a necessary move on the chessboard, designed to be seen by our opponent. It is a document of misdirection, intended to make Celeste believe she has won an absolute victory. She is a brilliant woman. Mara, do not ever underestimate her. Her understanding of finance is unparalleled, but her moral calculus is flexible. I saw it long ago. I saw the way she looks at Rivengate, not as a living entity, a legacy of healing, but as a collection of assets to be leveraged. And I saw the way she looks at you, as a liability. I could not fight her openly. It would have torn the company apart, triggered a battle on the board that would have destroyed shareholder value and perhaps the very work we do. And to be honest, I was a coward. I chose a quiet life over a necessary conflict, so I prepared for a different kind of war, a posthumous one, with you as my general. I had to stop, my vision blurring. I took a deep, shuddering breath and forced myself to continue reading. The red envelope contains a codicil to my will. It is a legal instrument, drafted by a separate law firm and witnessed by individuals unknown to our family or company. It contains a single, powerful clause. The clause is triggered upon the presentation of valid, verifiable evidence of two things. First, that you, as the primary heir of my bloodline, have been subjected to physical harm by any family member who stands to benefit from the primary will. Second, that there is evidence of an attempt to usurp or illegitimately control your rightful, albeit minority, inheritance. The codicil defines what constitutes valid evidence: an official report from a medical institution, a formal document from a law enforcement or public agency, or a verifiable video recording. If these conditions are met and presented to the trustees named within, the terms of the primary will concerning the control of your shares are rendered null and void. The temporary trust is dissolved, and all voting rights revert to you, immediately and irrevocably. My mind was reeling. He hadn't disinherited me. He had armed me. The public will was the bait, and Celeste's aggression was the trigger for the trap. The slap on the sidewalk wasn't her victory. It was her fatal error. I read on. The final item in this box should be a small, silver USB drive. I trust it is already in your possession, as I placed its counterpart in a place only you would find. It contains my own private analysis. It is a Rosetta Stone for the financial architecture I suspect Celeste has been building within Rivengate. It holds the keys, the account numbers, the cross-references that will connect her consulting entities to their final destinations. Use it to prove the second condition, the usurpation of your rights through the fraudulent dilution of the company's value. I reached into my coat pocket. The silver USB drive I had found in the coat was identical to the one taped to the back of the final page of his letter. He had given me 2 copies, a failsafe. The letter concluded with a paragraph that made my chest ache. Do not mistake this for hatred. Mara, I do not hate Celeste. In my own weak way, I even loved the woman I thought she was. But I do not trust anyone who believes in money more than truth. Truth has a permanent, unchangeable value. Money is a tool, and in her hands, it is a weapon. I have tried, with this last act, to give you a better weapon. Protect the company, protect yourself. Know that my greatest pride has always been you. I sat there in the silent, cold room for a long time, the letter in my hands. He hadn't been blind. He had been watching, calculating, preparing. All those years I thought he was capitulating to her. He was instead laying the foundation for her defeat. My grief, for a moment, was sharp and overwhelming. Then it receded, replaced by a cold, clear focus. I took out my phone and, with steady hands, I photographed every page of the letter, the red envelope, the key, and the contents of the box. I documented everything. Then, I placed the letter and the unopened red envelope back inside. I did not put the USB back. I now had both. Before leaving, I asked the bank manager for a roll of official tamper-evident tape. I sealed the manila envelope, then placed it back in the box. I then ran a strip of the tape along the lid of the steel box, signing and dating it across the seal. If Celeste ever discovered the existence of this box, she would know it had been opened, and by whom. As I walked out of the bank and into the sharp autumn afternoon, the wind felt different. The city around me seemed different. A gust whipped through the canyons of the financial district, rattling the windows of the Rivengate Tower in the distance. For the first time, I looked at my father's last will and testament not as a division of assets, but as what it truly was, a survival guide. And the first step was to follow the instructions. The next morning, the bruise on my cheek had blossomed into a work of art. It was a mottled, ugly sunset of purple and blue, a perfect semicircle that followed the curve of my cheekbone. When I looked in the mirror, I felt nothing. The pain was a dull, distant ache, a physical input that I logged and filed away. The discoloration was not an injury. It was Exhibit A. The emergency room at Northwick General was a symphony of controlled chaos. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and anxiety. A baby was crying in ragged bursts. A man in a dusty construction uniform was holding a bloody towel to his arm, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a flat, indifferent buzz. I took a number and sat in a hard plastic chair, my posture perfect, my expression neutral. I was an island of calm in a sea of distress. When my number was called, I walked to the triage window. The nurse looked up, her face a mask of professional exhaustion. "Reason for visit?" she asked, her eyes already on her computer screen. "I was assaulted yesterday afternoon," I said, my voice even and clear. "By a family member. I need to have the injury documented for a legal proceeding. I would like a full medical report and an X-ray of my left zygomatic arch." Her fingers stopped typing. She looked at me for the first time, her gaze falling on my cheek. Her expression softened with a flicker of sympathy, the default human response. It was a variable I had no use for. "Okay, honey, have a seat. The doctor will be with you shortly." The doctor was young, with kind, tired eyes. He gently probed the area around the bruise, his touch professional. "Definite soft tissue trauma," he murmured, making notes on a tablet. "Significant contusion. Does this hurt?" "Yes," I said, though the pain was irrelevant. "The pattern of the bruising is specific," he continued, tilting my head towards the light. "It's consistent with the impact from a hand. You can almost see the curve of the palm and where the fingers would have been. Yes, I said again. That is what happened. He ordered the X-ray. I lay on a cold table while a heavy, lead-lined apron was draped over my chest. The machine hummed and clicked above me, its mechanical eye capturing the state of the bone beneath the damaged skin, as I knew it would. The X-ray came back negative for a fracture. This was better. A fracture could be attributed to a fall. A deep, hand-shaped bruise could not. Before I left, I stopped at the medical records department. I need a certified copy of my report from this visit, I told the clerk. Please ensure that the physician's notes on the cause and pattern of the injury are included, and I need the specific ICD-10 code for the diagnosis. The clerk looked at me, perplexed by the specificity of the request. The code? Yes, it should be SO0A3XA, contusion of other specified part of head, initial encounter. I need that on the official record. My full name is Mara Quinn. I walked out of the hospital with a thick sealed envelope. It felt heavier than paper. It felt like a weapon. My next stop was the county courthouse. It was a gray, soulless building where life's tragedies were processed into paperwork. I filled out a petition for a temporary restraining order. In the section for describing the incident, I wrote a simple, factual account of the events on the church steps, devoid of emotion. I attached a certified copy of the hospital report. I also filed a formal request for the release of public records, specifically the video footage from the traffic camera located at the intersection of St. Ren's and 3rd Avenue, time-stamped for the exact minute of the assault. The clerk stamped my forms with a bored thud, took my filing fee, and told me a judge would review the petition within 24 hours. With the legal machinery in motion, it was time to engage my father's lawyer. I met Mrs. Hilliard at her office, a quiet, book-lined room that smelled of leather and precedent. She looked at me with an expression of weary pity, assuming I was there to contest the will. "Mara," she began, her tone gentle, "I understand this is a difficult time, but the will is ironclad. A challenge would be fruitless." I didn't say a word. I simply opened my briefcase and placed the sealed red envelope from the safe deposit box on the polished surface of her desk. Her eyes narrowed at the unfamiliar wax seal. "My father had a second law firm," I said. "He was more thorough than you thought." I watched her as she carefully slid open the envelope and read the codicil. Her professional composure was formidable, but I could see the subtle shift. Her back straightened, her gaze sharpened. She read the document twice, her lips moving silently. Then she looked up at me, the pity in her eyes replaced by something else, a keen, calculating respect. "Physical harm," she said, her voice a low murmur. "Verifiable evidence." I slid the sealed envelope from the hospital across the desk. Then I placed my phone on the desk and played the video file I had received from the courthouse an hour earlier. The footage was grainy, shot from a high angle, but it was perfectly, damningly clear. The hushed whisper, the sharp, violent motion of Celeste's arm, my stumble backward. Hilliard watched the video 3 times. The sound was faint, but the action was undeniable. She leaned back in her chair, her fingertips tapping softly on the codicil. The gears of her legal mind were turning, reevaluating every assumption, every clause, every consequence. "The conditions have been met," she said finally. Her voice was flat, a statement of legal fact. She was no longer Celeste's advocate. She was an officer of the court, bound to the text in front of her. "The temporary trust is invalid. The voting rights are yours." "I need you to arrange a formal disclosure," I said. "Private, at Old Foundry Trust. The trustees named in this document need to be present." "When?" 24 hours, I said. She nodded slowly, her mind already moving to logistics. "It will be done. What about Celeste?" "I'll handle Celeste," I said. Back in my office at the Rivengate Tower, the air felt different. I was no longer a ghost in the machine. I was the ghost who was about to take control of it. I opened my email and composed a new message. The recipient was Celeste Rourke. The subject line was simple: "Meeting request." The body of the email was just as simple. A model of corporate politeness. Celeste. An issue has come to my attention regarding irregularities in the disbursement of funds to our outside consulting services. It requires an immediate review. I have scheduled a meeting for tomorrow afternoon to discuss this. Your presence is required. Mara. Below the text, I embedded a calendar invitation. The time was 3:00 p.m. The location was Boardroom 17. Boardroom 17 was one of the few meeting rooms on the executive floor that was equipped with a high-fidelity, always-on audio and video recording system for the purpose of preserving a formal record of board meetings. It was a detail I was sure she had long forgotten. I attached no files. I gave no specifics. The ambiguity was the point. It was a hook, designed to snag her arrogance. I knew she would see it as an amateurish, desperate power play from a grieving daughter lashing out. She would come to the meeting not to listen, but to put me in my place once and for all. I hit send. The email disappeared into the digital ether. The countdown had begun. On my way home, I stopped at a small flower shop. I bought a large bouquet of white chrysanthemums, their petals crisp and clean in the fading afternoon light. I drove to the cemetery. The wind was cold as I walked across the manicured lawn to my father's grave. The new sod was still a raw, dark brown. I knelt and placed the flowers against the simple granite headstone. The scent of the flowers and the damp earth filled the air. I traced the letters of his name. Ethan Quinn. "I'm going to do it," I whispered to the cold stone. "I have the proof, all of it. I'm going to tell the truth, just like you wanted." A sense of peace settled over me, quiet and absolute. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Revenge was a messy, emotional indulgence. This was a correction, a rebalancing of the books, a final, necessary audit. The 24 hours before the meeting were not a period of waiting. They were a period of construction. I was not building a case. I was building a cage. My first move was to formalize the threat. At precisely 8:00 a.m., I sent a carefully worded email to Celeste, her assistant Janice, and Frank Merton, the chief auditor. The subject was sterile. Urgent. Notice of special compliance audit. The body was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It stated that, pursuant to Rivengate Corporate Bylaw 11.3, Section C, a section on discretionary risk management oversight that I myself had drafted and pushed through a committee 2 years ago, a random targeted compliance audit was being initiated on all service contracts with 3 specific vendors: Larkwell Advisors, Osprey Path, and Margate Solutions. The bylaw gave my office, Risk Analysis, the authority to demand all associated documentation for immediate review. The email concluded with a link to a secure server folder where they were instructed to upload all unredacted invoices, work logs, and correspondence related to these vendors by noon. This was the opening gambit, designed to trigger panic, and to channel that panic. I set a trap. On the secure server, I created 2 subfolders. The first, labeled Audit Docs Prelim, contained the bait. It was a set of superficially damning files, the suspicious invoices, the misaligned timesheets, but presented as a disorganized data dump. It looked like the work of an analyst just beginning an investigation, full of suggestive evidence but lacking a coherent narrative or the truly toxic proof. It was designed to make them wonder just how much I knew. The second folder, labeled Archive/XT4 Procurement, was locked with a higher level of security. To the casual observer, it would look like an unrelated archive for the Alzheimer's drug trial. Inside, however, was the real case. A meticulously organized collection of every piece of evidence I had: the satellite photo of the garage in Arden Park, the server logs showing the late-night deletions under Janice's name, the magnified image of the forged signatures, the audio file of the fumbling phone call to Margate, the screenshot of the shipping manifest with the matching CVV code. It was a complete, step-by-step chronicle of their entire fraud. I enabled notifications for any and all access attempts on both folders. I didn't have to wait long. At 8:07 a.m., exactly 7 minutes after I sent the notice, a reply from Janice hit my inbox. The speed of the response was a scream. "Hi, Mara," it read. "Celeste has asked me to handle this. I've started uploading the requested files to the preliminary folder. However, some of our scanned PDFs seem to be having formatting issues and are appearing corrupted. Could you grant me temporary administrative access to the folder so I can troubleshoot from your end? It would be a great help." It was a clumsy, transparent lie. There were no formatting issues. She wasn't trying to fix corrupted files. She was trying to see what was inside my files. She wanted to know the scope of my knowledge, to see if I had the smoking gun or just the shell casings. More than that, administrative access would have given her the permissions to alter or delete the files I had placed there. I did not reply. Instead, I watched my server access log. An alert popped up a minute later. Janice's user profile had attempted to access the locked Archive ACXT4 procurement folder. Access was denied. The bait had been taken. The trap sprung. She had confirmed she was looking for something beyond the scope of the audit. The next alert came 5 minutes after that, this one from a different system. It was a high-priority flag from our company's data loss prevention network. The DLP system is like a silent security guard that watches all data in motion, and it had just detected a suspicious action. Janice's workstation was attempting to run a script to scrub the metadata from the files she had just uploaded to the audit folder. Metadata is a document's digital fingerprint. It shows who created it, when it was last modified, a history of its existence. Wiping it is a conscious act of destroying evidence. I had anticipated this. I had configured the server permissions to allow the action, but to log it and save a pre-scrubbed copy of the original file in a hidden directory only I could access. I watched the alert on my screen, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. I let her do it. She was now actively, and provably, obstructing my investigation. I took a screenshot of the DLP alert, time-stamped it, and added it to my evidence archive. Next on the agenda was Merton. I didn't summon him. That would have put him on the defensive. Instead, I walked down to the auditing department, holding a tablet with an innocuous-looking spreadsheet. I found him at his desk, staring at his monitor, his face pale. He looked up as I approached, his eyes wide with a fear he was trying desperately to conceal. "Frank," I said, my voice calm and friendly. "Quick question. I was reviewing the end-of-quarter reconciliation scripts, and I saw a reference to an old macro, R-smooth. I can't find it in the Active Directory. Was it retired?" The color drained completely from his face. A fine sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He loosened his collar. "Oh, that," he stammered, avoiding my eyes. That's an old script. Obsolete. We don't use it anymore. Just some legacy code for balancing old ledgers." "I see," I said, letting the silence hang in the air for a moment too long. "Because it seems to have run as recently as 2 weeks ago on the consulting services ledger. Just thought it was odd." He didn't answer. He just stared at his screen, his knuckles white as he gripped his mouse. I had my confirmation. He was a co-conspirator, not an unwitting pawn. He knew exactly what the macro did, and he knew that I knew. My final preparations were for the meeting itself. I sent a single-key cryptic email to Mrs. Hilliard. "I request your presence at a meeting tomorrow at 3 p.m., Boardroom 17. Your role will be that of an independent observer. No further information is necessary at this time." She replied with a simple, "Confirmed." An hour before the meeting, I went to the boardroom. I connected my personal laptop to the room's sophisticated AV system. I didn't want to use the room's computer, which would have left a digital trail. I configured the main projector to mirror my screen. Then, I opened a dozen windows, carefully arranging them. On one side of the screen was my evidence, the video from the church, the hospital report, the chain of financial proof. On the other side, I opened a live web browser and logged into a secure portal. It was the portal for a small, private bank in the Cayman Islands. The final destination account listed on my father's secret USB drive. I had already used the credentials he'd provided to gain viewing access. The current balance was $8,214,350.17. I left the browser window open. a silent testament to the stolen funds, ready to be displayed. Just as I was finishing, my phone buzzed with a new email. It was from an anonymous, encrypted address. The subject line read, "Thought you might find this useful." There was no text, only a single image file attached. I opened it. It was a photograph, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. It showed two people at a candlelit table on the patio of an upscale restaurant, Forge and Finch. One was Celeste, smiling, a glass of red wine in her hand. The other was a man I recognized from my research as the registered owner of the post office box that served as the official address for Larkwell Advisors. The photo was time-stamped. It had been taken the night before the Q3 board meeting, the same meeting where she had pushed through the approval for their consulting fees. Someone else had been watching her, another enemy she didn't know she had. This was a gift. It transformed the abstract fraud into a tangible conspiracy, a picture of two thieves celebrating a successful heist. I sent the image to the network printer down the hall. I walked out and retrieved the warm sheet of paper. The photo was a little grainy, but the faces were unmistakable. I returned to the boardroom, placed the photo face down inside a plain manila folder, and set it on the table directly in front of my chair. The stage was set. The evidence was loaded. The pit I had been digging was now complete, the bottom lined with irrefutable facts and the top covered by a thin veneer of corporate procedure. All I had to do now was wait for her to walk onto it. Boardroom 17 was a glass box on the 40th floor, a soundproofed aquarium suspended over the city of Northwick. Through the double-paned, floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline was a silent, indifferent witness. The projector at the end of the long mahogany table was on, casting a blank white rectangle of light onto the far wall, a canvas waiting for a crime to be painted on it. Celeste sat at the center of the table, the position of power. She radiated a calm, almost bored authority, her posture impeccable. To her right and left sat Arthur Vance and Eleanor Shaw, the two independent directors on Rivengate's board. Vance was a stoic, silver-haired man from the world of old industry, while Shaw was a sharp, pragmatic woman who had made her fortune in tech. They were the jury. Frank Merton, the chief auditor, sat hunched at the far end of the table, looking as if he were expecting a verdict of his own. Mrs. Hilliard, my father's lawyer, sat quietly in a chair against the wall, her presence unexplained and therefore unsettling. I stood at the head of the table, my laptop open in front of me. I was not there as a grieving daughter. I was there as the director of risk analysis, and this was a final report. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. I clicked the first slide. A complex flowchart appeared on the screen. I called this meeting to present the findings of a special compliance audit. Over the last 2 quarters, Rivengate has paid over $8 million in consulting fees to 3 previously unknown entities: Larkwell Advisors, Osprey Path, and Margate Solutions. I advanced the slide. A satellite photograph of the garage in Arden Park filled the screen. This is the registered corporate headquarters of Osprey Path, a firm to which we have paid $3.2 million for on-site integration support. Another click. The 3 forged signatures appeared side by side, the identical flaw in the letter G circled in red on each. This is the digital artifact present on the scanned signatures of all 3 managing partners. I continued methodically, clinically, laying out the architecture of the fraud brick by brick. I presented the misaligned timesheets, the fumbling audio from the call to Margate, the evidence of the circular cash flow. I brought up the system logs showing the deletion of the $8 million equipment contract. Finally, I put the name of Merton's script on the screen in large, black letters, R. Smooth. "And this," I said, looking directly at the chief auditor, "is the name of the accounting macro used to systematically reallocate these fraudulent expenses across dozens of unrelated budgets, effectively making them invisible to our standard auditing procedures." Throughout my presentation, Celeste watched me with an expression of detached amusement. She didn't interrupt. She let me have the floor, a queen allowing a court jester to perform his routine before being dismissed. When I finished, she gave a small, theatrical sigh. She turned to Vance and Shaw, a condescending smile playing on her lips. "As you can see," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "my stepdaughter is going through a great deal of personal turmoil. It's understandable that she would look for complex conspiracies in the wake of her father's death." She then looked at me, her eyes cold. "Mara, there is far too much assumption here. You're connecting unrelated data points. Perhaps you should focus on processing your grief, not manufacturing data." It was the opening she had given me, the dismissal, the personal attack. "You're right, Celeste," I said quietly. "This isn't just about data, it's also about behavior." My fingers moved to the trackpad. I clicked a single icon on my desktop. The sterile financial charts on the projector screen were replaced by the grainy, high-angle footage from the traffic camera. The video was silent for a moment, just the image of the two of us on the church steps. Then, the audio kicked in, amplified by the boardroom's speakers. Her voice, a venomous whisper, filled the vacuum-sealed room. "No grudges?" The slap was shocking in its clarity. The sharp crack, my head snapping to the side, my stumble backward. I let the video play out. Her instant transformation, her false apology, her arm around me. Then, my own voice, quiet but clear. "Thank you for the confirmation." I stopped the video. The silence in the room was absolute. It was so profound, I could hear the faint hum of the server racks in the adjacent IT closet. Vance and Shaw were staring at the frozen image on the screen, their faces masks of disbelief. Merton looked as though he might be physically ill. Celeste's smile was gone, frozen on her face in a rictus of shock. She had walked directly into the center of the cage. "Mrs." Hilliard stood up. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She walked to the table and placed a thick red envelope in the center of the polished mahogany. "As legal counsel for the estate of Ethan Quinn," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence, "I am here to present a codicil to his will." She explained the clause. Her words were precise, legal, and devastating. She spoke of the trigger conditions: physical harm by a family member and the usurpation of an heir's rights. She presented the certified medical report from the hospital, detailing the contusion. She gestured to the screen. "The evidence," she stated, "is incontrovertible. The conditions have been met." Celeste finally found her voice. It was a strangled rasp. This is a fabrication, a family misunderstanding." "The usurpation of rights is the second condition," I said, my voice cutting her off. I inserted the small, silver USB drive into my laptop. A new window popped up on the screen. It was a spreadsheet. On one side was a list of payments to Larkwell, Osprey, and Margate. On the other was a series of swift, untraceable wire transfers from those accounts. And at the end of the chain, there was a final destination, a single line item: the Rourke Family Educational Trust. I looked at Celeste. "Your younger brother, David, is the sole beneficiary and trustee, isn't he?" A strangled noise came from the end of the table. It was Merton. All eyes turned to him. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling. "Mr. Merton?" I asked, my voice soft. "The R-Smooth macro. Who gave you the directive to create and implement it?" He looked from my face to Celeste's, a trapped animal. He stared down at his shaking hands on the table. "It was a directive," he whispered, his voice cracking. "From my superior." That was it, the final nail. "This is slander!" Celeste shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the floor. Her eyes were wild, the mask of control shattered. "This is a malicious, vindictive attack by a bitter child who was unhappy with her inheritance." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I simply reached for the manila folder that had been sitting in front of me. I opened it and slid the photograph across the table toward Arthur Vance. "This," I said, "was taken the night before you approved the Larkwell contract." He picked it up. His eyes widened. He passed it to Eleanor Shaw, who let out a soft, sharp gasp. The image of Celeste dining with the architect of her fraud was undeniable. "And this," I said, bringing up a final image on the screen, the screenshot of the data loss prevention alert, "is the log of your assistant attempting to scrub the metadata from the files submitted for this audit. 7 minutes after I announced it, an active attempt to destroy evidence and obstruct an internal investigation." Celeste stood there, speechless, her mouth slightly agape. She looked at Vance, then at Shaw, searching for an ally. She found none. Their faces were stone. Eleanor Shaw was the first to speak. Her voice was cold steel. "Celeste, I am invoking Article 7 of the Board's Charter. I call for a motion to place you on immediate, indefinite administrative leave, pending a full, independent forensic audit and legal investigation." Arthur Vance seconded without a moment's hesitation. "All in favor?" he asked, looking around the table. His hand went up. Shaw's hand went up. My hand went up. "The motion carries," Vance declared into the ringing silence. The verdict was delivered. The war was over. The motion had passed. The words hung in the air, irrevocable and absolute. Celeste stood frozen in the center of the room, a statue of incandescent rage. The vote had been a formality, a public execution of the power she had held for nearly a decade. But the suspension was only the first cut. The codicil was the final, fatal blow. Mrs. Hilliard stepped forward again into the center of the room's attention. She held the thick parchment of the codicil in her hand, her demeanor that of a priestess performing a solemn, ancient rite. "Before the board formalizes the minutes of this motion," she announced, her voice resonating with a new authority, "it is my duty to inform you of a superseding legal instrument. The codicil to Ethan Quinn's last will and testament contains a specific and binding executory clause." She paused, letting the weight of the legal terminology settle. She then read directly from the document, her voice clear and precise. "Should my daughter and heir, Mara Quinn, be subjected to verifiable physical harm by any member of my family, who is also a beneficiary with controlling interest or authority within Rivengate Therapeutics, all provisions of my primary will pertaining to the disposition of my controlling shares shall be rendered void." She looked up, her eyes meeting those of the two independent directors. "The clause stipulates that under these conditions, the temporary trust established to hold Ms. Quinn's voting rights is immediately dissolved. Furthermore, a secondary block of my shares, held in a private, undisclosed trust, shall be released and transferred to her name, in perpetuity." Celeste made a choked, disbelieving sound. This was a ghost she could not fight, a voice from the grave rewriting the present. "The codicil is specific as to the burden of proof," Hilliard continued, her tone unyielding. She moved with a chilling, methodical purpose, arranging the evidence on the table as if it were a coroner's display. "It requires verifiable evidence from one of 3 sources: medical, official, or technological." She placed the certified hospital report on the table. Exhibit A, a medical report from Northwick General Hospital, documenting a significant soft tissue contusion to Ms. Quinn's left cheek, consistent in pattern with an open-handed strike. Next, she laid down a folded legal document. Exhibit B, a temporary restraining order, granted this morning by the Northwick County Court, legally establishing a credible threat of physical harm. Finally, she gestured to the frozen image on the projector screen. And Exhibit C, a time-stamped video recording obtained from a public municipal camera, which captures the act itself. She looked at Arthur Vance and Eleanor Shaw. The board must formally acknowledge whether the conditions laid out in this legally binding codicil have, in their view, been satisfied. There was no debate. The evidence was absolute. The intent of the document clear. Vance, his face grim, spoke first. "As a director of this company, and a witness to this evidence, I acknowledge that the conditions have been unequivocally met." "I concur," Shaw added, her voice sharp as glass. "The terms of the codicil are active, effective immediately." A quiet but seismic shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. The tectonic plates of power had just moved. Hilliard turned to me. Ms. Quinn, with the dissolution of the temporary trust on your initial 10% stake and the immediate transfer of the 16% held in the secondary trust, you are now the beneficial owner and sole voting authority for 26% of Rivengate Therapeutics Class A shares. 26%, combined with the firm support of Vance and Shaw, it created an unassailable majority. I was no longer a minority shareholder. I was the controlling interest. The first act of that control was to bring order. I would like to propose 2 resolutions for an immediate board vote, I said, my voice cutting through the ringing silence. Celeste stared at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. She was seeing me for the first time, not as a nuisance, but as an executioner. Resolution 1, I stated, looking at Vance and Shaw, that the board formalize the suspension of Celeste Rourke, effective immediately, for the duration of a full internal and external investigation into potential corporate malfeasance, embezzlement, and assault. All corporate access, physical and digital, is to be revoked. All corporate assets in her possession are to be surrendered. I so move, said Vance. Seconded, said Shaw. All in favor? I asked. 3 hands, including my own, went up. The resolution passes. Resolution 2, I continued, not giving anyone a moment to breathe. That the board immediately engage an independent, third-party forensic accounting firm, to be selected from the Big Four, to conduct a complete audit of the company's financials for the preceding 3 years. Furthermore, that we issue an immediate and indefinite freeze on all payments and contract renewals with the entities known as Larkwell Advisors, Osprey Path, and Margate Solutions. I so move, said Shaw. Seconded, said Vance. All in favor? I asked again. 3 hands went up. The resolution passes. It was done. In less than 5 minutes, the entire power structure of the company had been dismantled and rebuilt. The edifice of Celeste's reign, which had seemed so permanent and monolithic, had crumbled to dust. I looked toward the phone on the credenza. Arthur, would you call security? Celeste flinched as if I had struck her. The final, public humiliation. Vance nodded curtly and pressed a button on the conference phone. Security to boardroom 17, please. We waited in a tense, unbearable silence for the 2 minutes it took for the security officers to arrive. They were large men in crisp, dark blue uniforms, their faces impassive. They entered the room and stood by the door, waiting for instructions. Ms. Rourke is to be escorted from the building, Vance said, his voice heavy. Her access badge has been deactivated. She is to be given a moment to collect her personal effects from her office, under supervision, and then removed from the premises. Celeste didn't move. She just stared at me. The mask of the serene, powerful matriarch was completely gone. In its place was something raw and elemental, a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. For the first time since I had known her, there was no artifice, no calculation, no performance. There was only the truth of her hatred, and it was a terrible thing to behold. Slowly, she turned and walked toward the door. As she passed me, she stopped. Her face was inches from mine. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The silent promise of retribution was a palpable force between us. Then, the security guards fell into step beside her, and she was gone. Mrs. Hilliard placed a document in front of me. It was the official minutes of the emergency board meeting. This requires your signature, Ms. Quinn, as the acting majority authority. I picked up the pen from the table. It was a simple, black ballpoint pen, functional and unadorned, not a sapphire blue fountain pen with a hook in its signature. I signed my name on the line. The M was clean, the line swift, the pressure even. My hand did not shake. In that moment, the entire timeline of the past week reconfigured itself in my mind. The slap on the church steps was no longer the end of a chapter of humiliation. It was the beginning of this one. It had been the precise, physical key needed to unlock the steel door of my father's final plan. Celeste, in her moment of supreme arrogance, had not been striking a helpless victim. She had been flipping a switch. She had been the author of her own demise, and I had simply provided the pen. As I set the pen down, a low, resonant sound began to fill the air, vibrating through the thick glass of the boardroom windows. It was the deep, sonorous chime of the old clock tower on City Hall. I glanced at my watch. It was exactly noon. 1, 2, 3, the bells tolled, each one a clear, definitive note marking the end of an hour, the end of an era. Everything, right on schedule, was turning to a new page. The machinery of the coup was not yet finished. As the two security officers moved to flank Celeste, she held up a hand, a flicker of her old command returning. "Wait," she said, her voice low and tight. She turned, not to the board members, but to me. She walked out of the boardroom and into the cold, sterile quiet of the executive hallway, stopping just short of the elevator bank. She knew I would follow. I did. With Mrs. Hilliard a discreet step behind me. The security guards waited by the boardroom door, a silent, imposing presence. "One last negotiation," Celeste said, the words coming out as a low hiss. The fluorescent lights of the hallway were merciless, carving sharp lines on her face, revealing the cracks in her perfect facade. "You think you've won, but all you've done is arm a bomb. You detonate this, you go public with this manufactured scandal, and you won't just destroy me, you'll destroy this company. The stock will plummet, our partners will pull their contracts, my father's legacy will be a crater in the ground. Is that what you want?" It was a classic move, the corporate equivalent of threatening to scuttle the ship with everyone on board. It was also the last move she had left to play, and I had already calculated the odds of her using it. I didn't answer her question. Instead, I lifted my tablet, which had been in my hand the entire time. I tapped the screen, waking it from sleep mode. Displayed on it was a one-page document. I had drafted it with a team of corporate lawyers, the ones my father had instructed me to contact in his letter, the night before. "There is nothing to negotiate," I said, my voice as flat as the glass screen. "There is only this. You can read it, or I can summarize." Her eyes darted to the screen, scanning the dense legal text. "It is a separation agreement and a confession of liability," I explained, my tone that of a technician listing specifications. Clause 1. You will tender your immediate and irrevocable resignation from your position as CFO and from the board of directors, effective immediately. Clause 2. You will voluntarily surrender all vested and unvested stock options. Clause 3. You will make a full and complete restitution of the $8.2 million you embezzled, plus interest, within 30 calendar days. The funds will be transferred from the Rourke Family Educational Trust, or any other source, directly back to Rivengate's primary accounts. I paused, letting the terms sink in. Clause 4. You will cooperate fully with the internal investigation and the independent audit. Clause 5. You will waive any and all rights to contest the codicil or any other aspect of Ethan Quinn's will. She stared at me, her breathing shallow. "In return for what?" she whispered. "What do I get?" "You get the company's silence," I said. "Contingent upon the auditor's confirmation of full restitution within the 30-day window, Rivengate Therapeutics will not file criminal charges. We will not refer the case to the district attorney. Your public statement will be a simple resignation for personal reasons. The company gets its money back, and you get to avoid a federal prison." It was a cold, brutal calculation. A public prosecution would crater the stock. Just as she'd said, it would punish the shareholders and employees for her crimes. This was not about justice in a courtroom. This was about restoring order to a system she had corrupted. This was about rebalancing the ledger. She stood there, trapped between the gears of her own making. The machinery of consequence was closing in. Her gaze shifted from the tablet to my face, searching for a hint of emotion, a crack she could leverage. She found none. A soft chime announced the arrival of the elevator. The polished steel doors slid open with a quiet hiss, revealing an empty car. It was her exit. one way or another. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The fight went out of her, the last of her power draining away onto the marble floor. As she sagged against the wall, she looked at me, a strange, pathetic echo of our encounter on the church steps. "No grudges?" she murmured. The words had no weight now, no menace. They were just the ghost of a threat from a world that no longer existed. "Correct," I said. "I choose order, not grudges." She nodded slowly, a barely perceptible motion. "Give it to me." Mrs. Hilliard produced a printed copy of the agreement from her briefcase and a pen. It was Celeste's own pen, the custom sapphire blue fountain pen, retrieved from her place at the boardroom table. She took it, her hand shaking. She didn't use the wall. She held the document in the crook of her arm and uncapped the pen. She signed her name at the bottom. The motion was hesitant, not the bold, confident slash of her usual signature. As she formed the flamboyant, hooked R of her last name, her hand trembled violently. The broad nib of the pen caught on the paper fiber and tore it, leaving a small, ragged rip in the middle of the letter. The hook was broken. She handed the signed document and the pen back to me. I reviewed the signature, then handed the paper to Mrs. Hilliard, who immediately began scanning it with her phone. One of the security guards stepped forward. He held a small, black handheld scanner. "Ma'am, I need your access card," he said, his voice polite but firm. Celeste reached into her jacket and produced the card. Her corporate ID. The guard took it and scanned the magnetic strip. A soft beep confirmed its deactivation. The system had already locked her out. She was officially a non-entity. Mrs. Hilliard looked up from her phone. "The scan has been sent to the board members and is now on file." The transaction was complete. All the levers had been pulled. Celeste turned without another word and stepped into the open elevator. The security officers did not follow. They remained in the hall. This was not an arrest. It was an expulsion. Just before the doors slid shut, her eyes met mine one last time, in the polished steel of the closing doors. I saw her reflection, small and distorted, shrinking into nothingness as the gap closed. Then, the doors sealed with a soft thud, and she was gone. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a secure text alert from the private banking firm I had engaged that morning. Target accounts frozen. Outgoing wire transfer of $8,214,350.17 initiated to Rivengate Primary Cash Reserve. ETA 5 minutes. Congratulations. The money was already flowing back. The system was correcting itself. I turned and walked back into boardroom 17. Vance and Shaw looked up as I entered, their expressions a mixture of awe and relief. The air in the room was lighter, the oppressive tension gone. I walked to my place at the head of the table. Clipped to the lapel of my jacket was my company ID badge. It identified me with my photograph, my title, and underneath my name, a single, defining label: daughter of the late CEO. I reached up and unclipped it. I looked at the plastic card for a moment, at the title that had defined my role in this building for so long. I was no longer a daughter waiting for an inheritance. I was no longer a peripheral figure on the edge of the frame. I placed the badge face down on the table. I didn't need that label anymore. With Celeste gone, a profound quietness descended upon the boardroom. It was the calm after a Category 5 hurricane has passed, leaving behind a landscape that is irrevocably altered. The air itself felt cleaner, lighter. Arthur Vance and Eleanor Shaw remained seated, a silent council that had just witnessed the complete and total restructuring of their world. Mrs. Hilliard gathered the documents, her movements efficient and precise, assembling the legal framework of the new reality. She placed one final document in front of me. It was the resolution to formally appoint the third-party auditing firm. It was the last piece of the immediate cleanup, the final signature required to set the great, impartial machine of forensic accounting into motion. I picked up the black ballpoint pen again. My hand felt steady, comfortable. I thought of the stinging heat that had bloomed across my cheekbone just 2 days prior. The memory felt distant, like a data point from a closed case file. The physical sensation had faded, replaced by a different memory, the solid, weighted feel of this simple pen in my hand as it moved across paper. Signing resolutions, reassigning power, correcting a fundamental error in the system. The pain had been the input. This signature was the output. I signed my name. The ink flowed smoothly, a dark, definitive line. Mrs. Hilliard collected the paper. Her work here finally done. She looked at me, a flicker of something unreadable in her sharp, lawyerly eyes. Perhaps curiosity. Perhaps even a hint of admiration. "Is there anything else you would like to say, Ms. Quinn, for the record?" she asked. It was an invitation to make a statement, a victory speech, a final condemnation. I could have spoken about betrayal, about justice, about the years of quiet observation and the pain of being underestimated, but those were words for a different kind of war, an emotional one. This had been a corporate action, a hostile takeover executed with surgical precision. My gaze drifted past her, through the soundproofed glass of the boardroom, down 40 stories to the city below. My eyes found the intersection of St. Rennes and 3rd Avenue. From this height, the cars were tiny metallic insects, the people microscopic and anonymous. I could just make out the corner of the church steps, the exact spot on the sidewalk where the camera had recorded her attack. It looked so small, so insignificant from up here, a single pixel in the vast grid of the city. Then, I turned my gaze back to the room, to the large monitor on the wall which still displayed the login portal for the Cayman Islands Bank. I had already logged out, but the bank's logo, a stylized lion holding a key, was a stark reminder of the numbers behind the emotion, the cold, hard facts that had underpinned everything, the balance sheet that was now being corrected. "No grudges," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the stillness of the room. I looked from Mrs. Hilliard to the 2 directors. Only ledgers. As if on cue, the networked printer in the corner of the room whirred to life. It began to print the fully executed copy of the separation agreement Celeste had signed. The machine made a soft, rhythmic, clicking sound as it fed the paper through, each click a gear turning in the new engine of the company. A moment later, the final sheet slid into the output tray. It was complete. The last line of text on the page was a digital timestamp, precise to the second, marking the exact moment the old regime had officially, legally, ceased to exist. I reached forward and pressed the power button on the large monitor. The screen went black. My own faint reflection, which had been visible in the dark glass, vanished along with the bank's logo. For a fleeting second, before the screen went completely dark, I thought I saw the ghost of a smile on my face. It was very small. I stood up. I didn't look back at the table, at the documents, at the people. There was nothing more to be said. The work was done. I walked to the door and pulled it open. I stepped out into the hallway, and the heavy door swung shut behind me, the latch clicking into place with a sound of absolute finality. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Let us know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts and share in the conversation. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please support us by hitting that hype button. It makes a huge difference.